Get on the other side of the yellow line, technically in the
Today you
battlefield.
can see we've got lots of colors out on the field. These colors represent the guidons that would demonstrate where all of the different units would be located. First off, we're going to show off our 1st Michigan Guidon. This is the 1st Michigan Regiment. The 1st Michigan mustered in Fort Wayne, Detroit in late 1861. This was the largest and most experienced of the regiments. It was the last regiment to come under the command of General Armstrong Custer just prior to the battles of Gettysburg. Next is the 5th Michigan Regimental Guidon. The 5th Michigan was mustered in Detroit in about 1862. They were designated as a mounted rifle brigade, and they were the first, they at first were not issued sabers. In late 1862, they were issued Spencer repeating carbines, as well as a brace of pistols. Next, we have the 6th Michigan Brigade, the 6th Michigan Regiment. They were mustered in Grand Rapids in the fall of 1862. They usually fought in unison with the 5th Michigan. They were a designated saber brigade, regiment. Next we have the 7th Michigan. The 7th was mustered in Grand Rapids in January of 1863. They were drawing soldiers from the west side of Michigan. They were also the smallest of the Michigan regiments. Next, we have our company guidon. Every regiment was broken down into companies, and a company would be made up of soldiers from one particular community, generally friends and family, that then presented themselves to the military as a unit. Next, we have the brigade guidon. This would have been headquarters for General Custer. This guidon would indicate where he was on the field at all times. Both soldiers on the Union as well as the Confederate side would know where Custer is just by looking for his guidon. And last, we have Libby. Libby was made by Elizabeth Custer. She designed and sewed this guidon for her husband just prior to the Battle of Falling Waters in the year 1863. And this became his personal guidon for the rest of the time. So now we're going to watch as the soldiers give most of the guidons to the dismounted soldiers so that they can then ride out into the field and show some of the maneuvers that they had to practice in order to be an effective fighting unit. You can see we have lots of different types of horses out there on the field, and some of them are taller than others. Typically, most of the horses during the Civil War would have been about 16, 15 hands, which means they'd be about 5 feet tall at the shoulder. Some of our horses in today's society are a lot taller than that, but that's not what you wanted if you were riding in the cavalry during the Civil War. You didn't want to be on a mount that was far too tall, putting you way up above everybody else. The other thing that is striking out there right now is you can see that we have what we call colored horses. The colored horses are the white and the gray. These were not a common color to find during the Civil War. The majority of horses back then were actually black or brown, sorrel, what we call them today. The colored horses would have been given to the leadership. For example, our captain is riding a gray horse that's in the center, and the band units would have almost always tried to ride white horses or the soft cream-colored horses. Nowadays, all of the horses that we have out there are privately owned, and so we pretty much will take the colors that we can get. You can see that the horses are just sort of walking in different directions now. They're walking in lines. Horses often had to learn how to behave out on the field. This is a very different scenario to what they might find in their regular day-to-day life, and so the horse and the rider needed to learn how to behave. Obviously, some of our horses don't always behave, and we can always see that out there in the field. But everybody's learning, everybody's practicing, everybody's trying to improve. You'll also hear the captain, who's on the gray horse. He's going to give a command, and then he will give that command to the bugler, who will then bugle the sound out for everybody to hear. The soldiers themselves really needed to know what those bugle calls were so that they could be prepared to execute the next maneuver. In most instances, they would have a sergeant who would be hearing that command right away and then giving the actual command to execute the order to all of the different soldiers once they're out there. A lot of times the way that these horses had to move out on the field is a little different than what they've been doing at home. And so the soldiers had to learn their words, they had to learn their commands, they had to communicate to the animal what it is they were actually trying to do. This was allow them to then be in battle, to come in contact with the enemy. Sometimes they were going to be fighting directly in front of them and getting up close to them. Sometimes it was movements that would allow them to move through the woods or allow them to move through the field. Oftentimes fields were not just empty fields, they would have obstacles in the way, and they'd have to learn commands to be able to stay in line, yet avoid some of those obstacles. You can also see now they're moving out in twos. Horses had to be able to ride close together. We refer to it as boot to boot. So sometimes they have to squish up real close to each other. Horses don't always enjoy being so close to each other, so it's a tactic that we have to practice and have to learn. You can see how they are moving in twos right now, but as the calls come up from the captain, the command, I should say, comes from the captain, and then it's bugled out to the troops, they'll change their direction and move in different methods. See how they all just moved from moving one direction across the field, and now they're moving 90 degrees in the opposite direction. They're still currently 2 by 2. And they can shift again. This would have been used to sometimes potentially evade an obstacle or get around some other piece of equipment that needs to be utilized. You can probably hear the sergeant out front yelling those commands. He's got to be in charge of his horse unit. Everybody's got to know what's happening and when to do it. So when he says go, you need to be ready and you need to do it. Most of the horses and riders out there today are wearing and riding in uniforms and saddles that would have been very similar to what was available during the Civil War. A typical horse had to carry approximately 200 pounds. That included the rider, the saddle, all of the food that they needed to consume for the next outing that they were going to be on. You can also see that the soldiers themselves have all kinds of weaponry upon them. Sometimes it's a rifle, sometimes it's a pistol, sometimes it's a saber, sometimes it's all of them. So they have to be able to ride with all that stuff bouncing around them, and they have to be able to move quickly and engage rapidly with the enemy. You might have noticed that some of the soldiers out there are wearing a red tie. This is something that we do currently in the Michigan Cavalry Brigade to honor the history of the brigade. Originally, George Custer, when he came into command, when George Custer was given the command of the Michigan Brigade, he was only 23 years old. He was the youngest general at that time. I don't know that anybody's ever been younger than him to take command at that level. General Custer is probably remembered most by us for his loss at the Battle of Little Bighorn, but General Custer was an amazing general for the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, and he was one of the leaders of the officers that helped to win the battles of Gettysburg. He originally came into the command. He was a brash person. He had long yellow hair, a big fluffy mustache, and he was very fond of wearing a red tie. You can imagine what his soldiers thought of him at that time. Custer had graduated from West Point, but he was actually last in his class, and he was under a court-martial. So people were not overly impressed initially, but he took command in a big way, and he absolutely motivated his Michigan cavalry. During the battles of Gettysburg, he led several saber charges uphill into the foyer, and he would motivate his soldiers by yelling, "Come on, you Wolverines!" Once his soldiers realized what he could do and what he could motivate the cavalry to do, it was real common for them to cut up anything that they could find that was red in order to put on a red tie to honor their general. Nowadays, our soldiers have to be given that honor. They have to perform several different things in order to be awarded the red tie. You can see how close we have some of those horses now. It's not a typical movement for horses to get that close, and so they have to be learning that. You can also see now they're doing what's called a wheel. This would be an amazing feat if you had 100 horses abreast performing a wheel like that. But typically a wheel is done in order to change direction of the entire rank of horses. It's difficult to maneuver that in a nice way, in a smooth way, because the inside horse, or the pivot horse, has to walk fairly slowly, turning just a little bit, where the outside horse has to really get up some action and move really quickly. The soldiers are also often requested, or required, I should say, to keep looking at their neighbors so that they stay up with their neighbor, they stay in line with their neighbor, so they keep some really nice, clear, crisp, straight lines. In the early stages of the Civil War, the Confederate cavalry was the force to be reckoned with. Jeb Stuart was an amazing cavalry commander, and he commanded forces and leaders that had a lot of skill and a lot of experience. More than half of the commissioned cavalry officers resigned their commission in order to fight for the cavalry. So Jeb Stuart had a lot of experience under his command. He also had horses that came with their rider. So the rider would bring their own horse, their own equipment, their own saddle. So they were real comfortable riding in that. Versus the Union soldiers, these were generally a different population of people. They often were not used to riding, so they didn't have that experience, and they didn't come with their own horse. But the advantage came as the war lagged on and took a lot of time, took a lot of effort. Horses died during the war, and they had to be replaced. And it was because of the Union's amazing supply chain operation that they were allowed to function by getting more horses. The Union had an amazing procurement operation such that they could replace horses, and Michigan supplied the majority of horses during that time. Now they're going to show you what a saber melee might look like. So they're going to approach each other, and they're going to be trying to have a little bit of action with each other. Now, of course, that's not something that a horse really likes to do, is to run straight at another horse, and they certainly don't like things like a saber swinging across their head and over their faces. So you have to train the horses to do this. So we sometimes refer to this as learning a dance out there, so that the horses learn to be able to come into contact with each other and still move forward and still able to get out and do things. You don't start off with this. Usually you start with the horse just walking between two horses and then trotting between two horses, eventually going at a further, faster rate. And it's not until they're really comfortable that you actually engage with the other person and swing sabers at each other. So you can see they're really moving fast at each other, and the horses are not overly thrilled about it, but some of them are really taken into the action and really get involved in it. This takes a lot of effort because not only are they swinging that saber over them, but they've also still got a hold of their other weaponry that's on top of them. The horses are used to this stuff jangling and bouncing up against them. So what he's just flown right now is called recall, and you can see our company guidon is out there in the field, and when the soldiers would hear that particular bugle call, they would want to head for that guidon. So they've got to keep a watch of where those things out there on the field because they don't want to get left behind, they don't want to be lost. So you can see they're going to come up and reform a unit next to their company guidon. You can also see that the bugler sticks right with the captain, and that's really important for him to be able to hear the captain's commands because he's the way that he communicates that command to the sergeant, who can then communicate it to his soldiers. There was no method of communicating messages while you're in an active battlefield without that bugle. You can only imagine that the bugler was super important to his company. He was also a prime target for the enemy. The bugler has to be able to ride his horse, hold his reins, hold his bugle. He may have some armory with him, but he might not be able to actually use it. So the enemy soldiers would make him a considered target to try and take out because it would really mess with their actual ability to communicate. Horses then had to also learn how to be active out on the field in doing different maneuvers. So we're now going to run what we call a saber line. First up, we're going to have Sergeant Graves. He's riding Rocky. Rocky is a Tennessee walker. He's relatively young to this. He's not had a lot of experience. Sergeant Graves has got experience, but everybody once in a while has to get a new mount. So you have to practice using your saber across your horse so that you can make sure that you get things done, get them accomplished. The last thing that they're trying to hit is that ring. And that's a really tough thing to do, guys. So if those soldiers pick up that ring, let's hear some applause for them because they really deserve it. Next up, we have Trooper Humphreys riding Hunter. First thing she does is swing down, or he does, I should say, is swing down, and that would be emulating a soldier that's down there on the ground. Last, we're getting to check that. Oh, did she get that ring? Yay! Awesome, good job. That shows how well executed she can do these moves. Next up, we have Trooper Dan riding Lewis. Lewis is one of the Morgan horses that we have out there on the field. Again, he is going to swipe down at that head. Next, to be a standing soldier. Now we're going to have him swing against a mounted soldier. And then again, lastly, aiming for that ring. Sometimes you want to take your time and get it right. Next up, we have Trooper Joe riding Rip. Again, he's going to swipe down to try and take out that lower person. Again, swiping across for a standing person. And then again, trying to take out a mounted person. You got to get your horse used to doing exactly what you want them to do. Excellent job, excellent job. Trooper Dustin riding Jupiter. Sometimes if your horse doesn't participate, you have to keep motivating him and keep him moving forward. We often do this at different paces. Sometimes it's only at a walk, sometimes a trot, sometimes it will be a full gallop. But you don't want to run a horse, yay, good job, good job. You don't want to run a horse too fast through it. You don't want to learn bad behaviors, so they have to learn how to do it easily at a walk and then move it up from there. Trooper Hal riding Hugo.
That's what Samantha has, is a Tennessee Walker. That
Awesome.
was my favorite. I've had a radio in
This is Hugo's very first event.
Well, man, he's trotting, you can't tell he's trotting.
Oh no, they don't try. They don't try. They walk.
Oh, very nice. I think both Trooper and Hugo need a round for that. That's the first time he's ever done something like that.
Anyhow, he's very cute.
Oh yeah. It's not called the glide ride for nothing.
Next up, we have Trooper JB riding Dash. Sometimes Dash is a little naughty. Still a success, still a success. Last up, I think, we have Captain Yeager riding Doc. Doc is a Tennessee Walker. Tennessee Walkers were horses that they really enjoyed because they have a really smooth gait. I think you can see, though, that they can also move very fast. Nice job, nice job. Next thing we're going to show is what we call a balloon line. It's actually a pistol range. Horses have to get used to the smell and the sound of gunfire. It's not something that they would normally have at home, and so they have to get used to being around it. We usually start by training the horses with gunfire from standing at a distance while somebody holds the horse. Eventually you get closer and closer, being near the horse so they can smell that gunpowder. It's not something they typically like. Eventually then you got to get up on their back so that you can shoot off the back of a horse. It's pretty common that you can shoot off the back of a horse once. But we wanted to be able to be doing this on a regular basis, so you need to be able to train them to tolerate it. They have to be able to tolerate shooting from both sides. This is Trooper Marty. Marty's riding Jack. Sometimes your weaponry during the Civil War did not always fire at the time it was supposed to. This is Trooper Udo riding Lexi. Again, he is trying to fire his gun, but sometimes the gun just doesn't go off, and that was actually very common during the Civil War. Now we have Sergeant Graves riding Lucky. Excellent, making a lot of noise out there. Good job, Captain Yeager on Doc. All right, good job. Apparently those white balloons are a little tougher than they look. So we're going to have some of them go through again. Trooper Marty riding Jack is going to go again. We'll see if we can get some of those balloons to come down. Might not work. Nice job, Trooper Udo. Good job. All right, Sergeant, see what you can do. Oh, those little white balloons, they must mean something. This is Bill. Bill's our bugler. So he normally rides in the bugle and doesn't usually shoot, but any opportunity to shoot off a firearm is a lot of fun. Trooper Hale giving it a go. I think some of our weaponry is just not up to what it's supposed to be today. Again, that was not an uncommon thing for the firearms not to fire the way they're supposed to. I don't think a soldier's going to give up until all those balloons are dead. All right, who's going to get that last one, gentlemen? Well, Trooper Marty and Jack gave it their best, but still no. Trooper Udo and Lexi are going to give it another shot. And they win! Yay, finally! Again, horses really had to learn how to do this because that gunfire is not something they're used to, and the smell is something that's pretty dramatic for them. It was more difficult to train a horse to tolerate